January 11th, which is something that I've reported before, that I've heard from other neighbors, but also January 24th, which is the Saturday before Nancy Guthrie went.
Let me tell you about a Sunday morning that began completely normally and ended with a question that an entire country has been trying to answer for 55 days. January 31st, 2026, Tucson, Arizona. An 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie had dinner at her daughter Annie's house, kissed her family goodnight, and was dropped off at her own front door at approximately 9:45 in the evening. That is the last confirmed sighting of her on Earth. The following morning, when she did not appear for a virtual church service at a friend's home, something she had done without fail for years, the calls began. Then came the knock on the door. Then came the silence that answers it. What authorities found inside that house and on that front porch is the reason we are still talking about this 55 days later. Her blood, confirmed through DNA testing by Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos himself, drops of Nancy Guthrie's blood found directly on her own front porch and a trail leading down the driveway. An 84-year-old woman who, according to Nanos, could not walk 50 yards on her own without assistance. She was not injured during a fall. She was not confused and wandering. The blood tells a story the words alone cannot. Now stop right there. Before we go a single second further, I want you to sit with that image. An elderly woman, her own porch, her own blood in the dark. Because everything that follows, every piece of evidence, every behavioral framework, every investigative thread traces back to what happened on that porch in the early hours of February 1st. And what I am going to walk you through tonight is not speculation dressed up as analysis. It is documented investigative reality, drawn entirely from named experts and verified public reporting. Everything you are about to hear comes from the FBI, the Pima County Sheriff's Department, credentialed forensic scientists, and former federal agents who have spoken publicly and on the record. And when we are done, I want you to ask yourself one question. Not who did this, the investigators are working on that. I want you to ask yourself why, after 55 days, the most powerful investigative apparatus in the United States has not yet walked into a courtroom. Because the answer to that question tells you something far more important than a name ever could. Here is where the investigation pivoted. On February 10th, 9 days into the search, FBI Director Kash Patel did something that stopped this country cold. He posted surveillance footage to social media, grainy, black and white, infrared, of a masked man standing on Nancy Guthrie's front porch, a man wearing gloves, carrying what appeared to be a firearm in a holster, with a backpack across his shoulders. But here is what the headlines did not emphasize nearly enough. That camera, the Nest doorbell unit mounted at Nancy's front door, had been physically removed from the property, taken, gone. Whoever was on that porch reached up and took it. They believed in that moment that they were erasing the evidence of their presence. They were catastrophically wrong. Working directly with Google, which owns the Nest camera platform, the FBI recovered the footage from what investigators publicly described as residual data sitting dormant in back-end server infrastructure. The physical device had been removed, the digital record had not. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed that the camera was tampered with and that data was recovered from back-end systems. Think about the psychology of that mistake for a moment. This person understood enough about the camera to know it needed to be removed. They did not understand enough about cloud architecture to know that removal meant nothing. That gap between partial knowledge and genuine operational competence is one of the most telling behavioral signatures in this entire case. What does that gap tell you about who this person actually is? Drop your thoughts below. When credentialed behavioral analysts watched that footage, they did not focus first on the weapon. They did not focus first on the mask. They focused on the walk. Former FBI agent and University of South Florida criminology professor Brianna Fox described the suspect's approach to that front door with a single word that stopped every expert in their tracks. She said he moved as though it were his own house, not nervously, not rapidly, not the way a stranger's nervous system forces them to move when adrenaline is flooding their body in a place they do not belong. He moved with what Fox specifically called an air of bravado, a comfort in that space that does not belong to a person doing something wrong in a location they have never been before.
And this matters enormously, because former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, the second highest ranking official the FBI has ever had, watched the same footage independently and arrived at the identical conclusion. He described the approach as notably lacking in furtiveness or concern. Two of the most senior law enforcement minds in the country, watching the same video from different vantage points, landing on the same behavioral read. Here is why that convergence matters. A stranger, armed and masked at 2 a.m. outside the home of a vulnerable elderly woman, does not move with casual confidence. A stranger's biology works against that. Their heart rate is elevated, their peripheral vision is heightened, their instinct is speed and concealment. This person took his time. He approached the front door directly, not through the side gate, not across the backyard. The front door, the way someone approaches an entrance they have walked through before. Ask yourself honestly, do you believe that walk belongs to someone Nancy Guthrie had never met? Tell us what you think. Now watch what he does with the camera, because this is where the behavioral reading becomes almost surgical. He raises his gloved hand and tries to block the lens with his palm. It does not work. He looks around. He looks at the ground. He reaches into the yard, grabs a handful of vegetation from a potted plant, and shoves it in front of the camera lens. He covers a $200 piece of modern surveillance technology with a handful of shrubbery. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Steve Moore said publicly and without qualification that in his entire career he had never encountered this specific response to a surveillance camera in a criminal context. And the description he used to characterize it is worth sitting with. Highly premeditated and completely improvised simultaneously. That is not a contradiction. That is a portrait. This person planned enough to understand the camera was a problem. They did not plan enough to bring a solution. And here is the element that behavioral analysts consistently flag as the most revealing part of the camera sequence. He did not destroy it. Within arm's reach of that porch, there were rocks, there were hard surfaces. He could have ended the problem in 2 seconds. He did not. Destroying a camera is the act of someone who has decided they are burning this scene behind them, someone who has accepted that the physical evidence trail does not matter because they will not be coming back and will not be identified anyway. Covering a camera, even clumsily, is the act of someone who still believes they are going to walk away from this cleanly. Someone still running the plan. Someone who, in that exact moment, had not yet accepted how badly things were about to go wrong. Retired Fairfax County Deputy Chief Christian Quinn told NBC News directly, "The gap between how this was planned and how it was executed is one of the most significant investigative signals in the entire case." Here's a question worth thinking about. If you were planning something this serious, would you forget to bring something to handle the camera? Or is this a person who had never actually executed a plan like this before? Former FBI Deputy Director McCabe made a statement about the firearm visible in the footage that deserves far more attention than it received. He said with zero ambiguity that no person with any law enforcement or military background would carry a firearm positioned the way this suspect positioned his, hanging at the front center of the body over the groin, inaccessible to either hand for any kind of functional draw. CNN firearms analyst Stephen Gowski identified the weapon as appearing consistent with a Sig Sauer P365, a compact semi-automatic designed for concealed carry. but the holster it was sitting in, according to retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Steve Moore, was built for a much larger frame revolver. The components are functionally incompatible. And then there are the gloves. The thick tactical gloves the suspect wore, the same gloves he wore specifically to avoid leaving fingerprints and DNA at the scene, would make it nearly impossible to get a finger inside the trigger guard of a compact pistol. The weapon was operationally compromised by the very measure he took to protect his identity. Behavioral analyst Johnny Grusing, a 25-year FBI veteran who was a lead investigator on the Golden State Killer case, offered a pointed assessment. The firearm may have functioned entirely as theater, not a tool of violence, a tool of compliance. Something to project threat to an 84-year-old woman standing in a doorway at 2 in the morning. Something to create a moment of frozen submission without requiring a shot to be fired. Because you do not need to discharge a weapon to control a person. You only need them to believe you will. If that framework is accurate, and multiple credentialed analysts have endorsed it independently, then the real mechanism of this crime was not the gun at all. The real mechanism was something else entirely. And that something else is the core of the most significant investigative theory currently being pursued.
If the gun was props and the approach was comfortable, what does that tell us about what this person actually planned to happen at that door? Share your read on this. Here is a development that dramatically reshapes the entire picture, and it did not receive nearly the coverage it deserved when it emerged. Multiple law enforcement sources confirmed to Fox News that a masked man resembling the porch suspect was seen at Nancy Guthrie's front door on a separate occasion, approximately 3 weeks before her disappearance. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer publicly described this earlier visit as what appeared to be a trial run, a dry rehearsal of the approach, the door, the layout, conducted weeks before the actual abduction. Let that breathe for a second. 3 weeks before February 1st, someone was already standing on Nancy Guthrie's porch, watching, learning, mapping, building a blueprint from observation. News Nation's Brian Enton, who has had more consistent ground-level access to this investigation than almost any other reporter, confirmed that FBI agents have been returning to the Catalina Foothills neighborhood specifically to ask questions about a nearby property that was vacated shortly before Nancy's disappearance, and about several homes under construction in the area, requesting the names of contractors and workers who had been active in the neighborhood in January. A retired Pima County SWAT commander told Parade magazine that the vacant property could have served as a staging location, a place from which someone could observe the neighborhood, learn the rhythms of daily life, watch who came and went and when, without ever appearing out of place. He said it would provide a cover story for being in the area at multiple times across multiple dates. This is not someone who drove through once and made a decision. This is someone who studied this situation, someone who had enough time, enough access, and enough reason to do that without drawing attention. The question that puts on the table is one investigators have been circling from the very beginning. What kind of person has both the motivation to plan something like this for weeks and the access to a residential neighborhood that would let them do it without raising a single alarm? What kind of person fits that profile in your mind? What do you think they were looking for during those visits? Let's be precise about where the DNA evidence actually stands, because the public narrative around it has been both overstated and understated in different directions. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed that DNA collected from Nancy Guthrie's property does not belong to her and does not match anyone in her immediate family or her authorized circle of contacts. Foreign DNA was recovered from the scene. That is documented. The FBI also recovered a glove approximately 2 miles from Guthrie's home that appeared visually consistent with the gloves worn by the suspect in the doorbell footage. DNA from an unidentified male was recovered from that glove and submitted to CODIS, the FBI's national database of over 19 million offender profiles. It returned no matches. That glove was eventually traced back to a local restaurant worker with no connection to the investigation. That is the honest part that some coverage glossed over. An early DNA lead that initially generated significant investigative energy was ultimately ruled out. But the DNA from the property itself remains active and unresolved. DNA expert C.C. Moore, who pioneered investigative genetic genealogy in the United States and has contributed to over 1,000 criminal identifications, told NBC News directly, if she were the person who took Nancy Guthrie, she would be extremely concerned, because using investigative genetic genealogy, that person will be identified. Here is my honest critique of how this investigation has handled the DNA question publicly. The communication around it has been inconsistent enough to erode confidence. Sheriff Nanos, at different points, described the DNA as mixed, as potentially belonging to the suspect, as yielding no CODIS matches, and as being actively processed through genealogy options, sometimes in ways that appeared to contradict previous statements. Nanos himself acknowledged missteps early in the investigation, including releasing the crime scene earlier than he would have in hindsight and delaying the FBI's involvement. These are not minor process errors. In a case where physical evidence is this scarce, crime scene integrity is everything. What was lost in those early hours may never be recoverable.
Do you think the public deserves more transparency on where the DNA processing actually stands right now? Or does investigative silence protect the case? This is the part of this investigation that nobody in mainstream coverage has been willing to say clearly enough, so I will. The Pima County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to invoke a territorial-era Arizona law requiring Sheriff Chris Nanos to answer questions under oath. Internal records from his previous employment revealed he was suspended 8 separate times during his earlier law enforcement career, including once for excessive force, and that he resigned from his prior department in lieu of termination. During a deposition, Nanos reportedly answered no when asked if he had ever been suspended. The records say otherwise. I am not here to convict Sheriff Nanos of anything, but I am here to say this plainly. When the lead law enforcement figure in a high-profile active kidnapping case is simultaneously facing a recall effort, a perjury allegation, a unanimous board vote demanding sworn testimony, and documented credibility questions about his own history, that matters. Not because it changes what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but because it shapes what the public can reasonably expect in terms of transparent, accountable leadership of the search to bring her home. The families of missing people deserve investigators who are not simultaneously defending their own professional survival. That is not an attack. That is a standard. Do you believe the investigation's integrity has been compromised by the controversy around Sheriff Nanos, or are these separate issues entirely? Strip away the noise, the recall effort, the inconsistent press conferences, and here is what the documented record shows about what investigators actually believe. Sheriff Nanos told NBC News in March that from day one, investigators held strong beliefs about what happened, and those beliefs have not diminished across the entire length of the investigation. He said they believe they know why this happened. He said they believe it was targeted. A former FBI special agent told Newsweek that behind the scenes, this case is, in her words, red hot. That the FBI is working with more investigative leads than most cases ever generate, and that the apparent public silence should not be interpreted as stagnation. Targeted. That word is load-bearing. You cannot target someone you do not have a relationship with, however that relationship is defined. You cannot carry a motive against a person who is a stranger to you. Targeted means this person knew Nancy Guthrie existed, knew where she lived, knew her routine, knew that she would be home, knew that she would be alone, knew that she would come to the door. The vacant house next door, the construction workers whose names are now being collected, the reconnaissance visits weeks before February 1st, the comfort in the approach, the belief that she would open that door. All of it points in the same direction, not to a random predator who picked a name from a phone book, to someone operating from within a radius of knowledge that only proximity, time, and relationship can create. And yet, 55 days later, no arrest. The question is not whether investigators know who they are building toward. The question former FBI agent Maureen O'Connell put best is this: they are having a hard time proving it, not finding it, proving it. That distinction is the entire distance between a theory and a conviction. On March 26, 2026, Tucson police arrested Travis Reynolds, a 22-year-old Pima County Sheriff's deputy, on kidnapping-related charges in a completely separate incident. He was fired immediately. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer addressed the public speculation directly, stating the method, the victim profile, and the physical characteristics visible in the Guthrie footage did not align with Reynolds. Wrong modus operandi, wrong everything. But here is what that arrest does to this case that nobody is saying directly. A sitting deputy from the very department leading this investigation was just charged with kidnapping. It does not mean he is connected to Nancy Guthrie. The experts say he is not. But it raises a question that nobody in an official capacity has been willing to address on the record. How thoroughly has the possibility of insider knowledge been eliminated from this investigation? Not accusation, elimination. There is a meaningful difference, and the public has not been shown that work. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She requires daily medication. She has been missing for 55 days. Her daughter has not returned to the broadcast she has anchored for years. Her family is not giving up. The community in Tucson is not giving up.
Somewhere in this city, someone is carrying a piece of information they may not even recognize as significant. A changed routine in January, a vehicle they had not seen before, a conversation that felt slightly off, a face that appeared in a neighborhood where it did not quite belong. The FBI's reward stands at $100,000. The Guthrie family's private reward stands at $1 million. $1 million for information that brings Nancy home. But here is the cliffhanger that 55 days has not resolved. The investigators say they know why. They say they know what happened. They say they're building towards something they cannot yet say out loud. The DNA is being processed. The genealogy analysis is running. The backpack trail goes somewhere. The reconnaissance dates point to someone. And yet tonight, Nancy Guthrie's porch light is still on. The family is still waiting. And whoever stood on that porch in the dark, they are still out there. If you know anything, anything at all, call 1-800-CALL-FBI. The family is waiting. Tucson is waiting. And somewhere, the answer already exists.